I was born into an amazing family of storytellers. The daughter of a German father and an Italian mother, I was the perfect combination of an extraordinarily organized over-exaggerator. These are great skills to have as a storyteller. Now that, combined with the fact that my family was the embodiment of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer misfit toys, really should have made me an incredible storyteller. I was the youngest of 5 boys in my family, and so I sort of was raised similarly to how a Navy SEAL would be trained. By the time I got to be 9, I had extraordinary skills in pyrotechnics and covert operations. And the one thing that the men in my family taught me was, if you live an extraordinary life, that your story will live on long past the point where you are alive. Starting with my father. Every time we were with my father, something amazing was going to happen. Like the time that we went to a camp in Canada, and we really wanted to be like the Joneses down the street. And they had this amazing surfboard that they towed behind their powerboats. We couldn't afford that, so instead my father took the bathroom door off, took the window out, put a rope on it, and we toured around that lake for the next 2 weeks like nobody's business. I think he got these skills in part from my grandfather. My grandfather was a very stern man, and he was the medical director at the state hospital. And I remember that he would take me on rounds with him into the wards. And one of the things that he always would say to me is the treatment for mental health is really about listening to people's stories. And if you can do that, you can treat anyone with mental illness. This came in very handy several years later when my cousin Christopher was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And when he went missing for a few weeks one summer, we were really concerned that that might be the end of his life. When he showed up at one point at a family barbecue and told us that he had gotten on a cruise ship in New York and had sailed all the way through the Bermuda Triangle in a hurricane, I knew that that was the moment that I understood what my purpose in life was to be. And it wasn't going to be a storyteller. It was going to be a therapist. I was a very quiet kid. I had a speech impediment until I was about 8 years old. I had a horrible stutter. But I knew that this was my life's work. And I was fortunate enough to spend 30 years becoming a therapist, and ultimately ended up teaching, which is what I do now, people that want to be therapists. But this story actually isn't about me. The story is about my Uncle Paul. My Uncle Paul was a writer, or at least that's what he would tell you he was, until the children started to appear in his life. And at the point where the children started to appear, my uncle realized that he wasn't going to make a living as a writer. And so he abandoned his writing career and his very expensive degree from NYU, and instead he became a madman. And so in the early 70s, my uncle opened an advertising agency in New York City. And you could easily think that that was selling out. But for my uncle, advertising was a way to make stories come to life for people. And he never lost the joy in that. And so every couple of months, my aunt would load this posse of Navy SEALs into the car, and we would drive into New York City, and we would appear at my uncle's office. And when we would pull up in front of the building, we would just tumble out and roll through those revolving doors, and we'd squeak our shoes across the marble floors. We'd leave as many fingerprints as we could on the brass elevators, and we'd go up to the 26th floor. And the second the elevator doors opened, my uncle would greet me and say, "Thank God you're here. There's a crisis in the art department." Now, the art department in advertising agencies in 1970 was mostly made up of people that were high, let's face it. I have no skills in this area. And so it was clear that he wasn't wanting me to draw for the art department. He was wanting to instill in me what it means to be a part of a team. This worked really well until the spring of 1972, when I arrived at his office and he said, there's a crisis in the art department, and I said, I have my own crisis happening. Tiger Beat magazine has just announced that the Partridge Family is going off the air. The Partridge Family was the family I wanted to be a part of. I had visions that they would show up in their bus in my driveway and they would say, we need a drummer, will you come with us? And I would say, yes, and I would head off. And so when my uncle heard this, he said, forget the art department. Assemble the writing team. And he brought all of his writers into one big room, and we drafted a letter to Brandon Stoddard, the head of ABC Studios, and we sent it off. And when we sent the letter off, my uncle said, remember that storytelling is the most powerful tool that you have. 3 weeks later, I got a letter in the mail from the director of ABC Studios, Brandon Stoddard, saying, thank you for your interest. We are not going to take the Partridge Family off the air. I had saved the Partridge Family. And that became my story for 30 years, until 2 months before my uncle was about to pass away from lung cancer, and he told me that was a lie. There is no Brandon Stoddard. We never sent a letter. The only reason I did that was because I wanted you to believe in how powerful you can be. My uncle didn't live long enough to see me become a comic or a storyteller or a drummer. But every time I stand on stage, I know he is with me. And I hope that he knows that I am the embodiment of carrying forth the story of a life well lived. Thanks, Uncle Paul.